and welcome to today's ALA Solution Series webcast, Safeguarding Your Business, a Legal Professional's Guide to Cybersecurity. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our webinar sponsor, IT Solutions. IT Solutions is a leading managed services provider with deep expertise in the legal industry, currently supporting over 120 law firms across North America. Through their specialized program, Total IT Legal, they provide proactive, secure, and responsive technology services tailored specifically to the needs of legal professionals. Their team of legal-focused strategic advisors and dedicated support staff understand the unique workflows and compliance requirements of law firms, from document management and cybersecurity to case management and client confidentiality. Thank you, IT Solutions. We're excited to be joined today by Tyler Sanders, the Regional Vice President at IT Solutions. Tyler has nearly 30 years of experience in the IT industry, much of it spent as a consultant helping law firms enhance their systems and implement remote access solutions. We're also joined today by Andrew Scott, Security Solutions Advisor at Total. Andrew is a cybersecurity leader with over 10 years of experience in security architecture, MSSPs, and SOC operations. Andrew specializes in threat intelligence, zero trust, and risk management. Welcome, Andrew and Tyler. We are looking forward to what you have to share with us today. So, Tyler, you can go ahead and take it from here.
Terrific. Thanks for the introductions, Joy, and thanks everybody for attending this afternoon. We've got a great webinar prepared for you on securing legal institutions, why cybersecurity needs to be a firm priority. So we're going to talk about how a proactive cybersecurity strategy preserves trust, revenue, and brand reputation. Before we get started, just hoping that a lot of you will be attending the ALA annual conference next week in Nashville. And if you are, please drop by our booth and come speak with us. We'd love to see you there. We're at booth 1107.
Cool. Yeah, so I'll get us started here, Tyler. And I really want to, set the stage looking at the bigger picture here of really where I think we see cyber threats, but really the importance of organizations and legal institutions transforming. So first and foremost is really the identity, being that new perimeter, and threats and also, kind of operational approaches where law firms are continuing to shift towards the cloud, how users are interacting in their environments, but also how threats, right, and threat actors are, targeting the identity and kind of stolen credentials, account takeover, a lot of that. And so it's really creating, a shift in attack vectors and tactics, but it's making identities really the weakest link, more and more so. And so one thing that we're also observing is that unfortunately, firms and many organization types are lacking, a fundamental understanding possibly of the risks of these users and who's got access to what data and where it's going and what's being done with it, right? There is that visibility gap, unfortunately, that we see more and more. And while there's improvements there, right, this continued shift towards users, the cloud, right, different kind of integrated ecosystems and technology is creating, I think, more of that perfect storm of, where are we aware of where our data is going and who's touching it. And so really, that focus needs to be towards business resiliency through data protection. Law firms hold lots of sensitive, critical information, depending on what type of law you do. So it could be, healthcare related, it could be PII, it could be intellectual property, it could be, M&A activity for your clients. And this is all really, really critical information to protect. So there really needs to be more of that integrated threat detection, really zero trust architecture, and ensuring only the necessary people have access to that information, how we constantly validating that and monitoring it to protect that lifeblood of law firms and that trust that you mentioned at the start there, Tyler. So, I don't know your thoughts on this, but that's really what we're seeing as a big picture here.
Yeah, and I guess, Andrew, identity being the new perimeter, it's a bit of a new concept, a bit of a new, terminology for it. Kind of give us, the layman's term, I guess, of what that really means.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. If we think about identity, let's focus on, many, attendees here might be, Microsoft organizations. So it's your email, it's your user, how are you logging in, right, to, various resources. Could be O365, could be the way that you're logging into your case management system. It could be the way that you're, tying various different solutions together. And so as organizations and especially law firms are both heavily in an office, but also out there meeting with your clients, maybe down at the courthouse, working in various functions out there in the field. The user and how they're interacting with that data wherever it's living, really is the new perspective and priority of where we need to be looking. Also, right, a lot of the threat landscape I mentioned that they're targeting account, stolen credentials, account takeover, adversaries, unfortunately logging in, they're no longer hacking in. So a lot of the shift in identity, both in how firms are operating, how they're interacting with that data, but also how adversaries are moving. I think that's really critical to reframe an understanding of what your risk is related to how your users are accessing information, how you're able to track that and monitor it.
Yeah, and I think you brought up some great examples there, but especially in a law firm, there are so many different systems now that people are logging into. And unless you've kind of implemented and leveraging single sign-on, you may have, upwards of 10 different logins, or sometimes even more than that I've seen in a firm. So each of those becomes an area of potential compromise, right? So making sure all of those identities are protected. Let's move on to a poll question, kind of get a sense of where we're at with the audience. So, how many of you believe that you're doing enough around cybersecurity to properly protect your firm, clients, and its reputation? Let's give it a few more seconds here, make sure everybody gets their vote in. Oh, wow. Okay. So it's almost a 50-50 split. We're a 43-57 split in terms of 57% of people feeling that they're not doing enough to protect the firm. And we're going to get a lot more into this during the webinar, but I don't think you're ever fully secured, and it's I'll refer to this throughout the webinar that security is a journey, not a destination, and you can continuously harden the firm's security profile, and we're going to get into different ways of doing that.
Absolutely. And so, that poll and the results there is, appreciate everyone's input. I think that kind of is a nice segue into this slide, right? Really, again, looking at what's the state that law firms are up against from a threat perspective, from a monitoring perspective, from protecting that critical information. And so, wanted to kind of really take a step back almost and build sort of the threat profile. Why would a threat actor target a legal organization, regardless of your size? You could be, hundreds of lawyers all across the globe. You could be a single sole practitioner, right, in a local, area. But why would a law firm be targeted? And I think it starts with that first icon there, sensitive data, whether it's PII, personal health information, financial and invoicing info that you've got to bill your clients. It's also, I mentioned like intellectual property. It's about, maybe M&A information they can get ahead in. You also have a lot of relationships to exploit. So while you yourself might be a great target, you are also a jumping point to many of your customers. So how you interact, right? I mentioned email, right? We've heard about this, trend of business email compromise and invoice fraud, and we'll get into this in a little bit later. But the way that you interact with your customers and those relationships or those critical partnerships or client services that you've got really make you a fantastic target, for better or for worse, by adversaries. Where that threat could be ransomware, right? We've heard about this in the news, quite, often throughout the last several years, where it's designed to encrypt all your systems, lock it up, make, kind of you can't access your case files, your litigation database, whatever it might be that you need to do work in. but also that shift towards data theft extortion. We'll get into this as well, but where they're skipping the ransomware part and actually just straight stealing your information and then extorting you. So there's less of a trigger there. Unfortunately, as we saw with the survey, right, some firms may have a less mature security posture. And this is just kind of obviously, it's a journey. Um, it's a prioritization approach that firms have to decide. Do we hire more lawyers? Do I, secure things? Do I, approach, kind of refreshing our technology? But for better or for worse, this really creates an attractive target because there's less obstacles to go ahead and exploit as an adversary. And so if we look at those most likely threats, obviously cyber criminals, number one, right? They're going to go after that. That data is of value to them, where they're going to resell it, they're going to extort you for it, what have you. They're going to put pressure on your customers, your partnerships. But also, I mentioned really in legal is fascinating because there's all different types of law. And so be mindful of who you do business with, how you do business, what your verticals or kind of focus areas are. You could be in the target of nation state adversaries. And this can be a little uncomfortable, but you might have clients or types of law, especially corporate law, that might be more attractive to a nation state adversary because of who that client is, potentially, or gaining access because they want to know what those organizations are doing, or maybe it's having some relationship with the government. So that's a key there as well. Also, supply chain, right? Tyler and I mentioned the evolution of technology in environments and legal institutions and legal organizations of, kind of the cloud, integrated systems, all different kind of ways that, law firms are adapting, but that also introduce additional risks and maybe potentially visibility gaps or vulnerabilities because of the technologies and partnerships you're using. So how are you looking at what service providers, what technology you're using? How is, your partnerships and ecosystem there is, tied together? And then finally, insider threats. And an insider threat doesn't necessarily have to be malicious in intention. It could be user error and accidentally emailing out or disclosing, kind of client information, or oops, we left some systems exposed to the internet and, kind of readily available. So it could just come down to those different components, but really getting a picture of why would you be targeted, but also, some of the most likely threats. So, Tyler, I kind of painted a larger picture, but, from your experience and perspective in, kind of the legal sector specifically, kind of what is your thoughts about, examples of legal practices and kind of some of the things that why they would be targeted, or threats they might experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on some already, but really, what a threat actor wants to do is they want to get the most bang for the buck. So, where can they get the most payout for the least amount of effort? And in a lot of law firms, it's the perfect scenario for that because we know most firms are storing a lot of very sensitive data, and it's almost the crown jewels of a firm is the data that they're hosting and should be securing. And a lot of times, law firms don't have the same level of security that bigger organizations, more mature institutions, or even corporations have. So right away, threat actors look and say, okay, hey, let's see if we can hit this law firm, small, mid-size, even larger, but small, mid-size are usually the prime targets because in a lot of cases, they put less into cybersecurity and protecting this data and protecting the data governance that they use within the firm. So if a threat actor can hack in relatively easy for less time and money than it would cost for a more complex organization, they know if they can get to your data, they can shut down your systems. There's a high likelihood that there's going to be a big payout for that because a firm can't afford to be down. A firm does not want to have sensitive data exfiltrated for sale on the dark web. So by being able to hack into a law firm systems fairly easily in some cases and be able to have a big impact resulting in a big payout, it's the perfect target to go after.
Absolutely. So, kind of, looking at some statistics, right? And kind of what have we seen, generally kind of the amounts. So I mentioned cybercrime, where those projected damages by threat actors are really expected to exceed $10.5 trillion. I mean, this is a country's GDP, most likely, but this is a significant amount. You mentioned that high payout. This is what it's going to start to cost. Not just specifically against legal, but all industries, but legal's a fantastic target towards this number. But I mentioned identity to start with, right? And we look at that shift, as I was mentioning, 558% increase in identity-focused attacks since 2023. That's not small at all. And it signifies a considerable shift of how adversaries are looking at and targeting organizations, that they're trying to stay more stealthy, kind of, blend in with the noise and using users, right, and stolen credentials to be able to identify and track and stay kind of hidden, but grab information that's readily available to that user, right? Think about everything you may share in your email inbox, whether it's internal reports, maybe it's memos, maybe it's access to SharePoint or other, kind of resources. All of that might be there if they log in, right? So, if we think about, and look at the impact, then 47% of small businesses, this is just looking more generically, we have some, legal statistics, but, experienced an attack in the last year, where we see that 31% of clients will terminate a relationship following a data breach. And this is even more impactful for what legal, where really there is that reliance of trust and reputation, that attorney-client privilege that is really critical to that relationship. And if that's broken, really, what does that mean for your organization, your firm? you know, and we see that, you mentioned small and medium-sized firms there, really 3 times more likely to be targeted. And that's just simply because of, unfortunately, less mature security posture, things of that nature. But, these are really some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of, the growth and impact of, cyber threats to, various industry verticals, as well as, the impact of what firms can experience.
Yeah, and I've got to think of that 47% of small businesses. A big portion of that would be professional services,
Yep.
law firms particularly.
Yep. And there's a couple other points here. Can you go back for one moment
Yeah,
here?
sure.
I just want to kind of, highlight some of the legal stats, right? Specifically for law firms that I think, attendees may want to be aware of. There was a survey by, a couple different research firms in 2024. At least 40% of law firms experienced a security breach. Okay, not just an attack, but an actual breach, which means like loss of data, loss of availability of the systems. And so nearly half of firms are getting breached, not just attacked. Attacks are happening all the time. Where we saw also, according to a survey done by Clio, that the average cost of a data breach to law firms in 2024 was 5.1 million, just shy of that, which is more than a 10% increase from the following year. Now, obviously, there's all different types of, sizes of firms, right? But like that kind of also highlights the potential financial impact. We'll get into this later, but I think there's one more statistic that I think was really impactful, where 56% of law firms that experienced a data breach in 2024 lost sensitive client information. So, we talked about that, the onus of trust and attorney-client privilege and protecting that information you have. What would that do to your firm if that was to get out, if that were to be lost? And I think that's just, some specific points there for legal that I want to make sure that our attendees were aware of, because that definitely sort of paints the picture of what we're talking about here and what need to be protected most. Cool. So, we're very lucky in the industry that, Verizon's data breach report that they do every year was just released. And there's some interesting insights here. So it's kind of building on what we've been seeing, but, 37% increase in ransomware attacks year over year. We talked about, kind of ransomware, various attack vectors, where 44% of those attacks, data breaches involved ransomware of some kind, right? So being aware of, what's my backup strategy? How am I, able to conduct business if I do get ransom, but also how am I preventing this maybe from happening initially, or can I catch this? Where $115,000 is that median cost of a ransom payment kind of across all different types of verticals. But if we look at SMB, so this, how Verizon defines that is really less than 1,000 employees, right? So many firms are going to be less than 1,000 employees. 88% of organizations under 1,000 employees experience ransomware extortion related attacks versus large orgs. Okay, so unfortunately, they're coming for small and medium-sized and lower level and smaller enterprise organizations. And 22% of all breaches are using credential theft or some sort of component of the identity for initial access. So obviously, folks are seeing a trend and pattern here with what we're talking about, but it just continues to grow. Additionally, right, I mentioned supply chain a couple slides back, being aware of what technology is using, how is that integrated into your ecosystem, vulnerability exploitation trends. So 34% increase on VPN, the remote authentication, authorization approach, but and perimeter device vulnerability exploitation attacks, including 0 days. Adversaries are trying to punch a hole through the primary mechanisms you have for remote workers to gain access to the corporate environment securely, and they're trying to target the actual technologies there. And so being aware of your risk or exposure, how you're using, right, VPNs, or ensuring remote or hybrid work, or your lawyers that are out there in the field, how are they accessing resources securely, needs to be at the top mind of many of our attendees and firms in general. Yeah, so Tyler, I don't know your perspective on kind of what you're seeing, or your thoughts on how this relates to the legal industry, but these are some
Well, yeah, just a couple of comments because these are great examples. And when you're talking about, the vulnerability exploitations and stuff, and the increase in VPN exploits and stuff, I think there's, people get a bit of a false sense of security even with MFA. And MFA is a great platform to have on to protecting your identity. But there's something called, MFA fatigue now, and where you're getting so many pop-ups, whether it's Authenticator or Duo or something to approve. And what the threat actors will do is they'll, steal the credentials and just keep putting in requests to get the MFA side approved. And people just kind of tuned out on thinking, is this me? Do I really need to pay attention to this? And just kind of clicking approve for it to go away. And these threat actors are gaining access just by people clicking approve, simple format to get in, but it's effective, and they just keep trying until they get that approved. Also, on your point, when we're looking at this median cost of a ransom payment of $115,000, I think that's probably the smaller amount of what the cost that would have that comes into play when you're looking at a ransomware attack, and when you're looking at all the remediation steps that go into it, all of the forensics and other pieces. I mean, Andrew, do you have any idea how much, what a multiple you could put on that $115,000 to kind of understand what the cost of that breach may be?
Yeah, I don't have the multiples, but we'll explore this more, kind of later in the presentation, because it's important to understand that the ransomware payment, or there's all different types of costs that are going to come with the breach, as well as, right, what that reporting and reputation damage would have to be, that public, kind of having to acknowledge and disclose that breach, and that being public record. So there's a lot of other variables that come into play, and other types of impacts that are going to occur. And so we'll look at what those financial components are, but it's a kind of one piece of the larger sort of cost, is that ransom payment itself.
Yeah, downtime, and most law firms are billing by the hour, so every hour you're down, there's some tangible numbers that go with that loss of opportunity. There's lots that goes into what that total cost of a breach may be.
Yeah.
Got another poll question for you. So, have you been subject to a business email compromise attack, or know someone who has? This is really simply somebody's, clicked into a fictitious, malicious type of email, either passed email credentials through, or opened up some vulnerability as a result of responding to an email they shouldn't have. Yep, not surprised by the results. So 83% of the attendees said yes, they have. And I I was going to guess about 90% because most firms have experienced this. The impact can vary dependent on, how malicious that attack is or how successful that attack is and how far they've gotten along. But simply being able to phish credentials or gain access to a system or a set of data is pretty common and probably one of the most common methods of attack, right, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, which is a nice segue into our next slide, where I think it's important we're talking about identity-related threats. So we're just going to kind of highlight what BEC, business email compromise, can mean, but also the different components to it, right? So it comes with, stealing, login credentials and potentially those tokens, if everyone's ever selected, stay, logged in for 30 days. That's a token that's, removing that need for MFA. You mentioned that bypass. And so really this allows criminals to gain access to legitimate business emails, okay? Whether that's, I mentioned invoice fraud. So think about if you're a billing administrator or, kind of maybe it's an office manager or legal administrator, is sending out invoices to your clients, right? And your user, your account gets compromised, and suddenly that adversary is sending, oh, hey, we need, to update our billing. Can you actually send the payment to this bank account? This is a common thing, right? And maybe some of the folks who said yes have experienced it or know of those who have. And suddenly your clients are wiring money to some other, the adversary's bank account. You're not getting paid and they're out money as well. So, that's that fake invoice, right? I also mentioned impersonating a partner, really injecting themselves into the relationships you have, or misleading them, trying to disrupt something, or to glean more information from them. And that could be stealing intellectual property, right? I mentioned, what access and information do your users, right? It doesn't just have to be lawyers, right? Or your kind of paralegals or different legal staff. Could be others. What do they have access to across the environment, and that information? And so, the graph on the right-hand side is also pretty telling. We see kind of the complaints crater in 2020, but the costs and then complaints and costs going up from 2020. Well, what happened 2020? We all went home, right? So the pandemic hit, remote work and hybrid work suddenly became critical, and the user identity became much more central to how we work. And orgs have adopted this, and they're not going backwards. So we saw cloud adoption, more integrated use of SSO and identity and various things. And so this has been coupled with that rise in BEC we continue to see. So, for instance, right, BEC has surged 1,760% in the last year, which is nuts. So this is rising considerably, right? We're also use of AI is pushing this forward. So as much as law firms and organizations of all types are adopting AI to gain efficiencies, so are adversaries, right? It's making them far more adaptable, able to also wage more campaigns and attacks at scale and speed. And we're also seeing that considerable dark web sale of credentials. 775 million credentials for sale, email and password combos. And so that can be sold for as little as a couple dollars. Think about like $5 footlongs at Subway, being able to spend $5 and get, credentials that you can sell, right? Can buy and log into an environment with. This is incredibly, attractive, but also the barrier to entry to conduct these types of attacks is very low now, for better, unfortunately. So what this means is BEC and identity-related threats are going to continue to be a heavy focus for adversaries and related to like law firms specifically. So, Tyler, what are you seeing around the role of identity? We already kind of looked a little bit of this, but how should organizations be evaluating their use of technology, the cloud, the other types of resources and assets and relationships they have where identity and technology are kind of tied into that? What specifically for legal firms would you recommend they start to think about with this?
Yeah, I mean, first going back to the business email compromise, what we've seen, these threat actors are a lot more sophisticated than they ever were, and they will, infiltrate a mailbox, for instance, and they will watch it for a long period of time. So they may, be able to infiltrate one of the partners at a firm's mailbox, and they watch the way that partners corresponding with others, and starting to, through social engineering tactics and stuff, starting to understand, who are the accounts payable people in a firm? What's the finance department? How do they interact? And watching these emails for a while, and then plotting their attack. So it can be as simple as, this partner going on vacation, this partner out at a trial, and they know this because they've been watching the emails leading up to that. And now this attorney or this person within the firm is now out and not able to access their email for the day because maybe they're in a mediation, a trial, whatever it is. And they already know now that kind of who this partner or this attorney or somebody in the firm interacts with in finance to get a wire transfer authorized. And then that's when they'll pounce and they'll jump in and say, hey, Marge, I'm out at a trial today, but I really need this wire transfer completed, in the next 15 minutes, or else we're gonna, we're gonna suffer a penalty or whatever the rationale behind it is. They can start to use AI to generate some of the language and text to make it, replicate what the way that partner or person normally uses in terms of their form of communication and the way they compose emails and things like that. And we've seen a lot of attacks happen as simple as that, just an email authorizing some sort of financial transaction or something because they fraudulently hacked into this person's email account. But the bigger problem, even outside of business email compromise that we're seeing a lot in firms is kind of what we call data sprawl. And this is where a firm will it's kind of on their own, different people within the firm adopt different technologies that they'll leverage to share data. So things like Dropbox, OneDrive, there's a zillion of these out there now. So a quick, easy way they need to share information, and they think, okay, you know what, rather than just emailing it, a lot of the time it's not even that they're thinking from a security perspective. There's file size limitations in the email. So they're like, all right, I've got to get this file over quickly. I'm going to sign up for a free Dropbox account, drop a bunch of data in there, and then they keep leveraging this. And people throughout the firm do this more and more, and they're doing it with no data governance around it, with nobody else having awareness to this. And over time, now you have all these different identities out there and all of these different file sharing platforms with sensitive data that nobody's managing, securing, or even aware is there. Who knows what happens over time? Maybe those people are no longer with the firm. So you've got this data sitting out in some data file sharing repository that nobody knows exists, nobody has the access, and nobody secured it. And that's one of the big things that we see firms kind of having get away from them, is they don't have this kind of control and data governance around, how they share files. It's a requirement. It's a necessity of a firm to be able to share and move around large data files and things. But there needs to be some structure, some data governance, and some standardization in it to make sure it's secured, managed, and ideally that it's purging over time. If those files only need to be there for 1 week, set an expiration date on them so that they're not sitting there indefinitely and just open to theft and extortion.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, kind of data governance and, including, kind of whether it's, kind of shadow IT or other different resources. I mean, users are always trying to be more efficient and effective with their time, right? But what's interesting too, there was another, takeaway. I think it's, in addition to the data and the resources, also personal assets. How are people engaging with those? And is there, BYOD, or is there, bring your own device or other resources? Because, one, thing it made me think of, there was, from, I mentioned Verizon's data breach report, 46% of compromised systems had corporate logons on non-managed corporate systems. So basically, people are using their corporate logons or other, kind of accessing resources from their own personal devices that may be getting compromised, maybe, little, control or protections there, where they're trying to interact and integrate wherever they're working or however, whatever those hours are. So being aware of what those other, file sharing or other resources are, and the way that your users are also leveraging their own personal systems or corporate, or firm managed devices, is also critical to that data governance. And where's it heading? Where's that the data going, I think, as well.
Oh boy, did that throw a lot of complexity into our world when I hate bringing up the pandemic and having to go back to that, but where out of necessity, everybody kind of had to go to a BYOD model. But here we are in 2025, and we see so many firms that still have this, but don't have the controls and the security and the structure in place to effectively control the data through a BYOD type of policy. So that's an ongoing issue within firms for sure.
Yeah, and kind of, shifting a little bit, I mentioned ransomware and that trend, and really, the shift towards data theft extortion. So data theft extortion, right, is really the continued adaptation of adversaries and cyber criminals, especially to, as defenders, thankfully, are getting better at battling ransomware. They're just now starting to skip the ransomware step. So you see the diagram on the right, but really their goal is to access an environment, often through stolen credentials, token theft, a lot of what we talked about, watch and monitor and observe where this information lives, who's got access to it, or where those kind of data repositories are. And then they're going to use legitimate technology solutions that may not trigger alerts, whether it's file transfer services or remote management solutions, whatever it might be, to exfiltrate that data. They're going to steal it. So notice no malware or anything that's going to, derive alarms and triggers and, bells and whistles has been deployed at all. And so it's really designed to evade detection um, and steal that data. And then they're going to go ahead and start extorting you. The other thing is there's the double extortion mechanism where I'm going to steal the data first as an adversary, and then I'm going to deploy ransomware to cause you further pain. So not only have I stolen your data, your backups aren't worth it, because the data's gone, right? But also you now don't have access to your systems. And so this is an evolution that we now need to be looking, as I said, where that data is, the data governance that Tyler mentioned, and who's got access to it, because we need to be now looking at the way users and data are interacting and where it's going, because this is the shift where adversaries are continuing to move there. I mentioned the median payment of ransomware being 115K. We're also seeing where data theft, extortion, payments and demands are now going upwards of 600,000 because they've already got the information. There's not much you can do about it. It's not like they've locked it up. They've already stolen it. And so what do? You have to get it back. They've got it no matter what. And so this is really, kind of that evolution there. But, Tyler, do you have any, examples of, organizations or others that have been, cloud hosting providers that have been breached, or anybody that has faced a similar, experience or incident like this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have one of the more extreme examples that still sends chills up my spine when I think of it. But one of our closest competitors, who was an MSP that was providing private cloud hosting to law firms, about 30 law firms on their private cloud. On Christmas Day, they got infiltrated and or just attacked, and it shut down the entire cloud infrastructure through ransomware. They'd been in there for a couple of months plotting this attack. They encrypted the backups. They had first, though, exfiltrated all of the data from these 30 law firms on this private cloud, and then ransomwared it. And Christmas Day, so the MSP was on a skeleton staff. They sent a note saying Merry Christmas. And for 2 weeks, this MSP struggled to try to get the environment back up with limited amounts of data sets. So a lot of data was just lost through this, and all of the data was exfiltrated, and they were extorted, and it was for sale on the dark web and exposed, and they got hit with ransomware fines. It put the MSP out of business and puts a lot of firms in a really difficult situation. So it very scary moment.
Yeah. So, we kind of, shifting gears here a little bit, we've looked at, kind of various different components. And I think, what we're getting to ultimately is the connection between technology and cyber risk with ultimately business and firm risk, where that could be, strategic risk of, kind of certain data, or, kind of your role and reputation. Obviously, there's reputational risk there mentioned as well. really, coming under the gun because, the cyber risk is exposing this, or there's financial implications or operational risk, right? You work off of billables and, lawyers being able to deliver and to, execute. But what if they can't access systems or do their work? Or, mention going into a trial, Tyler, and suddenly you don't have access to information. What's that going to do to you? And so ultimately, Tyler, I guess, kind of how do you think this slide applies to legal specifically, right? All the components of business risk tied in with cyber.
Well, I think all of this is why law firms have become such a desirable target for threat actors' cyber attacks, is because they understand the importance of the data. They understand, the need to be operational. I mentioned it earlier. Every hour of downtime is potentially an hour of unbillable time. Times however many people are billing in that firm. Obviously, the reputation, the last thing a law firm needs is to have to disclose the fact that their client's data has been exfiltrated, that they've suffered this breach, especially if there was some negligence on the part of the firm in not providing the basic security controls, at least to be able to protect that. Could come into some, state compliance, some certain compliance in different practices of legal. Um, I mean, all of these things are really what make law firms such a high profile target, and the reason why hopefully all of you are attending the webinar today is to help understand kind of, what steps you can start to take and how you can continuously look for ways to improve your security posture, because it's always evolving. I mean, every time we're able to protect from a potential type of breach, they figure out a way to overcome that and find a different way to exploit something. So it's this cat and mouse game, but all of these are the perfect examples why law firms are a target. And I mean, there's a little bit of paralysis from analysis I've seen at some firms where you start, it's all so overwhelming and you're thinking, oh geez, like I don't understand this enough. There's too many things I hear about. EDR, I hear about SOC SIEM, I hear about all these things that don't mean anything to me. And as a result, some firms just, they're paralyzed into taking any action. And the consequences of inaction are a lot of the things we've already described, but the financial loss, we've talked a lot about what the costs, both the hard costs, soft costs are, regulatory fines, legal liability. I mentioned the fact that there, you could get a negligence type of lawsuit against you for not having the basic security components necessary to secure your client's data or other data. Eroded customer confidence. I mean, if you have to disclose the fact that your client's data has been exfiltrated and is available on the dark web and stuff, that's very hard to maintain your reputation and retain your clients. And we're seeing in certain practices of law, like whether they win or lose clients, is largely based on their security maturity level. So insurance defense is a great example. Firms working with banks and stuff, and each of these clients, let's use the example of insurance defense. Each of these insurers will have their own list of security requirements that they're expecting law firms to have, and they'll rate the firm based on that, like a security scorecard, and they will give more of the business to the firms that actually have the higher scores on security. And this is continuously evolving. We have to work with our clients on going through these audits and assessments, and every year they get more stringent and they expect more controls and security layers to be in place. But I expect, not only in these specific practices of legal that I described, but across the board, people are going to expect and hopefully get regulated at some point. So there is a standard that everybody has to adhere to.
Yeah, and so we've talked a lot about the impact of a breach, and I want to just kind of quickly touch on we talked about, we get to some of the broader financial implications and impact of a breach. Want to be able to get to solutions and strategies. Where can attendees and law firms start to shift? But I think it's also important to kind of frame up the overall costs, right, of a breach. not just if it's like ransom, but you mentioned, fines, investigation recovery costs, and, forensics. And what does that cost your reputation, whether it's, lost clients or having to go out and spend more money to get a new client on board, those missed opportunities or their costs. And so we see the average cost here, kind of the middle column, but also the high end, right? And so this is really depending on client verticals you have, the size of your organization, kind of how many assets. Like investigation recovery can be sizable if you've got a lot of lawyers that are billing that cannot access, assets for days or weeks because forensics is taken over, right? And the cyber insurance is saying we have to lock every system down that was impacted until we're done. You got a lot of people sitting around, and that's the cost of that plus, right? Missed opportunities there. So ultimately just encourage folks on the line here to really just think about what these various different categories mean to you, the potential implications, potential costs, just starting to evaluate what those risks, kind of and willingness around cost, but also kind of where you need to start to prioritize. How can we, kind of, better prevent, having to be in an investigation recovery situation or avoiding those fines. And yeah, so Tyler, I mean, I think, what I would love to kind of start looking like what are the key features of that effective security strategy. I think that's where we're starting to get to. But where are you seeing, kind of what in your mind is a good, start for law firms and legal institutions to start to build that security strategy?
Yeah, there's a lot of components that could go into it. And we have a tendency as a starting point to kind of reverse engineer even back from a cybersecurity insurance policy. So that kind of being the minimum bar of what is required of a law firm, because if you can't get insurance, then there's, potential malpractice. I mean, everybody on this call should have cyber insurance as part of their policy. It's probably the best money you can spend on insurance. And those components, it's usually for us, well, that's always what we bake into at least our core offering, and then have some more mature even platforms where we kind of know those things or those compliance checks or those security audits are going to go. Andrew, do you want to touch on each of these, and I can give them in the context of a law firm? And
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, we talked about the speed of adversaries and cyber criminals and attackers, but where's data going, right? So, I think observability, getting eyes in, what's happening, where's it going? And this is really that integrated, threat detection response. How are we able to identify everything going on across my environment, every asset, every user, the way that, maybe we're working in the cloud, how is that operating? But also, what is the incident response strategy or capability? How would we, if we had a breach, how would we respond? Could we? And really gauging, your existing capabilities or where you need to be based upon what you have and what your willingness and is to protecting that information. The next thing is really zero trust architecture. Think about it as, you know, who doesn't need access to sensitive client information, maybe starting there and starting to wall off your organization or your assets or the data, making sure that only the necessary people have access to what they need. And this is also going to benefit, we call it, reducing the blast radius. But, if there was a compromise, it means that the impact and exposure would be limited or minimized because there's really not much for that attacker to gather up, to grab, to be able to achieve. Also, before maybe you've detected them and stop that, right? So that's sort of coupled with the threat detection response, and then really getting at data protection, right? Encryption is key, obviously, both at the asset level, encrypting that data, encrypting your systems, but also encrypting the transaction, kind of the transmission of that data. How are we sending data in a encrypted and hidden fashion, and really focusing on also not, kind of data governance, as you said, Tyler. Where is that data going? Who's got access to it? How are we ensuring we're getting it to the right people, that they're also protecting this? And I think, finally, just the last one cannot be overstated. Proactive hygiene in systems, or a lot of the kind of breaches and incidents occur simply because, well, we got to go back to fundamentals and back to basics of continuous monitoring, patch management, ensuring the right systems are provisioned and hardened, that you've got the right reporting and auditing. Are we looking at what's going on in the environment? Are we kind of ensuring things are, following process and things like that? But, Tyler, I don't know if you want to add anything else there that, kind of just in mind, but
And it's funny because I think, as you said, it's one of the most straightforward and obvious things that are the most neglected. And I know most breaches happen as a result of poor hygiene. So really important. I mean, simple things like, patch management. There's a reason why Microsoft releases patches at the frequency they do. And we hate the patches because they often inadvertently break something or cause issues, but they're almost always geared towards protecting some vulnerability that has been exposed. Managing, data governance, it's many different things, but at the most simple level, it's understanding, for instance, your shares that you have on the network or hosted in a cloud provider. What is the security around that? And that even gets back to just zero trust architecture, some very basic things like making sure you're reviewing who has access to the partners folder or the HR folder or the finance folder, simple things like that, and really restricting that access down and auditing that on a regular basis so that you're always aware of, what data you have, what the protection around that data is, of course, around your entire network, firewall maintenance and management, patch management, firmware updates on devices. With the Internet of Things, there's been a lot more exploits that happen in obscure kind of ways. There's stories about people being able to hack in through managed copiers that are on the network, managed UPS battery backup systems that are on the network. And these things get installed and they're just left with all the defaults and never firmware updates. And threat actor, somebody gets into the environment and starts scanning or finding a way to get from the outside to get into the environment and scanning and finding these open network devices that they can infiltrate through and gain access to the rest of your network. So very simple hygiene like that that often gets neglected and often is the root cause for an attack. Leaving port 3389 open. How many times I've heard that? The most obvious known exploited port on a firewall that just gets left open without security on it and stuff. So there's lots of tools, and as you mature, you want to make sure that you're implementing the right tools and understanding what they're doing and what you need to protect. But at the most basic level, that system hygiene is critical. So, what success looks like? Success, I can start by saying that there's an awareness and a commitment to improving the security in your firm. So again, sticking to some of these basic things it's people, and a lot of this starts from the top down. So making sure that there's buy-in at the partnership level, all the way down, that we as a firm agree that we need to develop a culture of security focused people. That it's everybody's responsibility to double check emails, make sure that the examples I gave of dropping files in non-governed types of file sharing platforms that you go a little rogue and do, all of these things need to happen. And then what success looks like is, I mean, you're going to have a reduced number of incidents, frequency and severity. At the beginning of the webinar, we talked about that hackers will look for the most bang for the buck. So the easier they can get into your systems, the more likely you're going to get attacked. It's sort of like, I'll use the analogy of your home security. If you have, locks and alarms and cameras and floodlights and all these things, that theft is more likely to go to the neighbor's house that doesn't have those things in place. And it's exactly what's happening with the hackers. Is they're going to run some scans, they're going to try to crack some passwords, they're going to try to exploit your firewall, do all these things. And the harder it is for them, the less likely they are going to continue with that. It takes time and money to be able to do that. So by doing something to get started and to at least make sure that you're showing that the basic controls and the basic elements are secured, it's going to help a lot with reducing the number of potential attacks that can happen. You want to be in a state that you're audit ready at all times. I use the example of the cybersecurity insurance policies, and as an MSP, we saw this as a bit of a blessing in disguise because all the things that we were telling our clients for years that they needed to adopt, and the controls they needed to put in place, and the policies, procedures, all these things that we were telling them. Now, all of a sudden, in order to get insured, they needed to have these in place. And if you're checking yes to them and you don't have them in place and something happens, there's a good chance your insurance isn't going to cover it. So using this mentality that you're audit ready at all times, that, when you have, whether it's a client that's going to do an audit, whether it's the insurer that's going to do these audits, that you're in a state that demonstrates you have compliance and can do that confidently. Improving the competitive advantage. I use some examples of how, like in insurance, for example, they will actually score the law firm and award the person with the highest scores in security, the business and stuff. So making sure you have these controls, these security layers in place to give you that competitive advantage. And client trust and confidentiality assurance. Client trust is a big thing. I was working with an accounting firm a couple of years ago, and they were asking me to email sensitive financial information to them. That was it. I gave them a secure platform to manage the data through, and I moved on to another firm because I'm like, these guys are not conscientious enough to think about protecting my financial information. And just in the transmission of it, what about where they're storing it and what they're doing with it after? And if they get exfiltrated, it's going to be easy, it sounds like, for them to have an attack in my data get exfiltrated. So clients are going to be a little more savvy and start to recognize this. So the more that you can demonstrate that your security is first and foremost top of mind, you're going to build client trust and demonstrate that your firm is security conscious. So a proven plan to increase the success here. We've kind of gone over some of these concepts, but being able to assess where you currently are, so building out that baseline of understanding where you currently stand. And this is something IT should be working with you on an ongoing basis. I meet with a lot of firms looking to change IT, and some of the questions I ask them right out of the gate is, okay, where is there potential risk to the firm, or what are you doing to secure your data? What are you doing to protect the firm? And a very common answer I hear is, well, I don't know. Our IT is taking care of that. Those days, unfortunately, are gone. That now it's a shared responsibility that the firm needs to be involved with IT. And really what IT's role and responsibility is in all of this is to make sure that we're divulging all of the potential areas of risk within the firms and strategies to mitigate them. And it's not up to us necessarily to be the ones that say, yes, do this, because some of it could be a very low likelihood of risk and a very high cost to be able to secure that area. But it's our job to present that to the firm and make sure that you're the ones making those decisions from a business perspective. Is this going to keep me up at night? How important is this to us? How much of an investment, whether it's a financial investment, whether it's a time investment? I mean, even developing policies and procedures helps so much. We talked about your internal people being a potential threat or a large threat. Policies, procedures, and structure around that really help. So these are the things that IT needs to be bringing to your awareness, and then you can decide whether, okay, this is something that we want to do right away. This is more a long-term goal, and building out a security roadmap. So assessing where you currently are, understanding where the highest probability of risk and breaches, and then working your way through a roadmap to really start to harden all the different areas and reduce your risk over time. And that goes into the planning stage, right? So that you've got, whether there's a lot of different frameworks out there, security frameworks. That's a great way to continuously harden and improve your security. But some of that can be overwhelming, and some of that can be a lot for a firm that hasn't really put a lot of commitment, investment into security. But having a plan in place is really important. And we like to project out. So we'll look down the road and even say, okay, over the next, 4 to 8 quarters, every quarter we want to improve your security posture. And we're going to move the needle very slowly in each of these areas to make sure that we can get you there. Security, unfortunately, it can be disruptive. It's inconvenience. Going back to the analogy of a house, we don't want to have to have multiple locks on the door, alarm systems, all these other layers, but we know the importance of doing that. Unfortunately, IT security is very similar from that. Then it's a plan of rolling it out, implementing it in a controlled way so that it has the least negative impact on people. We don't want to lock people out or not have them able to access their systems and their data. So and that's why I like to stagger it out so that we're not crowbarring in a ton of security all in one weekend and stuff, and nobody can work Monday. It needs to be staggered. It needs to be staged. It needs to be planned well. Managing it, this ongoing management of understanding where there's risk, policies, procedures, making sure you understand any compliance requirements, cyber insurance requirements, managing your data, managing the IT, and then continuously optimizing it so that over time, you look back and you have a security, either a framework or a scorecard, something that you can identify where you stand and how you've progressed and where you need to continuously develop it. You have anything you want to add there, Andrew? I know we're getting out of time here.
Nope, I think you summarized it pretty well.
Okay. Do we have time for a few questions? I know we're right up on the hour.
Yeah. Yeah, Andrew. Well, we are at time, but let's go ahead and if you could just share like how would someone begin or what's next steps here for our attendees.
Do you want me to run with that one, Andrew, or?
Yeah, if you want to start out, that'd be great.
I
Yeah.
mean, I'd go back to some of the basics. Make sure that you're working with an IT provider that is talking to you on a regular, ongoing basis about where you stand from a security position. They're providing evidence of what they've done to, do that basic hygiene, that they've got proactive resources dedicated to aligning and auditing your systems against security best practices, and that they're involving you in the direction that your security is going. I mean, that's a pretty easy one to at least get started and make sure that you've got the right partner in the right direction.
Yep. And I'll kind of couple that. I think a good starting point is just awareness. You can't protect what you don't know you have, and you can't protect what you can't see. So, do you have, kind of awareness and monitoring into the whole environment? That's typically where we see like an MSSP or an MSP taking more of that security monitoring function. But, Tyler mentioned getting a plan. I think also working with or identifying whether it's, some support, or whether you're handling it internally, aligning to a security framework or best practice, right? NIST has them, CIS, Center for Information, Internet Security also has their CS controls. They're great starting points, whether it's your service provider or your own internal IT, identifying what that structure of best practice looks like and really understanding what are my crown jewels. I think what is that data that we value the most, and starting there, who's interacting with it, where is it going, how are we best protecting that. Don't boil the ocean, and just kind of protect, kind of what the core fundamentals of that firm and your data are. I think are great starting points to start to establish that plan and process forward.
Just get started, right? Just
Yep.
just do something. Anything is better than nothing. This is such a layered approach. You can go on and on and on with different layers of security, but don't get stuck because it's overwhelming. Just, everything you do is going to put you in a better position. So just continuously hardening the environment and making your team more aware of where there's risk, how to handle data. Security awareness training is a simple one to make sure people are aware of what to look out for in business email compromise threats and things like that.
Great. Thank you so much, Tyler and Andrew. We are out of time. I think there are a few questions that came in chat. Attendees, if you did ask a question that we didn't get to, I will make sure that I send them off to the IT solutions team, as well as I did put Mary Rodenberger's email address in the chat box if you have questions or want to connect with any of these 3, then you please use that email in order to do so. And remember that they will be in Nashville. So go ahead and stop by booth 1107 and say hi, ask your questions directly there. So this concludes today's Solution Series webcast. We want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you to IT Solutions, Andrew, Tyler for this great information. And we'd love to invite everyone to join us on another webcast in the future. So please visit our event calendar to sign up for those webinars. Have a great day, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.